Cecily says, are you testing it to see if it's possible to do both at the same time? Cecily says, are you testing it to see if it's possible to do both at the same time? Cecily says, are you testing it to see if it's possible to do both at the same time? Cecily says, whoa. Showtime Forever says, sup guys. Cecily says, Showtime. Showtime Forever says, how y'all doing? Showtime Forever says, L doing well. Cecily says, you are playing some very majestic music today. Showtime Forever says, wait, you have a YouTube? "500 likes. Wonderful. Showtime Forever says, okay, L in my mom room so I can do it on TV. Showtime Forever says, oh so cool. Thank you Psylocks.m for the share. Showtime Forever says, is it the draw SESH with Gravoth or Gravoth? "1,000 likes. Epic." Bloomy says no she. Bloomy says hot damn. Super Marsek says the face. Sunny Guy 122 says would you ever make mechs inspired by the VR game Underdogs? Thank you for the share. Thank you Divine for the share. Flaxen_5 says no need for a good face cause nobody is looking at it that much. Alvin says I already ate yams for dinner. Sunny Guy 122 says not me. Charlotte's first hair strand says oh you she I. Apologetic T says I finally made it. Thank you Userandreg153283 for the share. Apologetic T says long time no see. OMG thank you, happy face. Thank you Widgyman for the share. Sunny Guy 122 says like I don't get why people hate the face, lol like it's not even worth the hate. Thank you Deadlocked for the follow. Cecily says she is cute. Apologetic T says graduated college bro. Apologetic T says I'm hoping to make a book soon and thank you. Showtime Forever says nice art by the way. Random_account 16 says hi. Apologetic T says not yet, I'm still nervous to post. Says hey yi gray. Sunny Guy 122 says I only have drawn 6 characters in my story lol. Random_account 16 says nat instagram people are much worse. Says who s this? Sock for none says oh you. Apologetic T says it's not the rudeness, it's just making vids makes me nervous. Sock for none says now we're talkin'. Thank you Banana for the share. Random_account 16 says insert the mighty eagle gif with the binoculars. Says oh. Apologetic T says oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Says sorry I want hear. Sunny Guy 122 says at random_account 16 fr. Black Magic_Crim says goddamn. Says yes OFC. Apologetic T says I'ma be reading, hopefully here soon. Henry says BBL. Sunny Guy 122 says what is your story called? Showtime Forever says is issue 2 almost done yet? Thank you Karnthi Betrayer 4 for the follow. Random_account 16 says how old are these characters? Apologetic T says I'm loving all the designs I've seen, they look amazing. Sunny Guy 122 says have you made any Latina characters? Random_account 16 says oh okay. Says at random_account 16 why you need to know? Thank you Daniel for the share. Random_account 16 says at. I just wanted to make sure. Says at random_account 16. Thank you DIDHE011 for the follow. Thank you Obbit for the share. Showtime Forever says what is happening in the chat. Thank you random_account 16 for the follow. Cecily says this is interesting character intel. How old do you imagine Zoe is? Showtime Forever says 2 mods? I'll only see 1 mod. Showtime Forever says, surprised face. Says I thought it would be Cecily because they're here all the time. Cecily says okay. Cecily says he. Cecily says those are cool looking sheets. Showtime Forever says lot of cool characters and fantastic stories. Apologetic T says making a book is hard, I kinda made one my final semester lol. Showtime Forever says it takes time and you can take a break if needed. Jake Doe Stuff says what does the front of her look like? Jake Doe Stuff says oh okay. Sunny Guy 122 says so does each character have their own individual mech? Apologetic T says roughly 10 pages, it was a poetry book. Apologetic T says yup. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. 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 Thank you Butterfinger for the follow. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. 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 Apologetic T says you can kinda read it on my Insta, it's the mutual Obs Zion post I made a couple months back. Says wish I was there for that, would have had a field day. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. Apologetic T says oh my. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. 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 Mellow says oh lore. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. Thank you __ for the follow. Yacht says yo add more shine bro. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. Showtime Forever says thanks Butterfinger. Cecily says LOL. $3,000 likes. Epic. Jake Doe Stuff says laugh cry 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 laugh cry. Cecily says Zoe is my goat. Says draw the front don't leave. Says anyone. Thank you LPOEO Apropapi for the follow. Cecily says yeah, a front post of Zoe would be fi. Apologetic T says the colors, chef's kiss. Jake Doe Stuff says at Cecily yep. Cecily says at Showtime Forever now we're talking. Sunny Guy 122 says, do the mechs have their own weapon when they fight or just their fists? Showtime Forever says at Cecily, yup. Mokobsf says cool art and keep up the great work. Thank you Mokobsf for the follow. Showtime Forever says Zoe is a legend. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. Jake Doestuff says not again. Showtime. Dirk says think of the money. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. Cecily says Butterfinger consider spamming likes. Showtime Forever says for real. Jake Doestuff says I Loki sent 150 likes. Thank you Butterfinger for the share. 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 Cecily says oh no. Showtime Forever says PLS stop this madness. Thank you Jojo Lion Kira Yoshi Cage for the follow. Jake Doestuff says Zo Loki bad. Cecily says this is one of the funniest lives I have ever attended. Thank you Jackson Base for the share. Says chill. Jake Doestuff says how long did it take you to draw this? Cecily says OMG that was funny. Thank you Are you sure? For the share. Sunny Guy 122 says so is the back profile of Zo done? Showtime Forever says imagine you have her in like a Power Ranger pose when they change into they suit to fight bad guys. Jake Doestuff says dang. Jake Doestuff says at Sunny Guy 122 I think so. Thank you M for the share. Apologetic T says what was the inspo for their outfits? Ryanix says that's a big pound cake. Apologetic T says that's so fair. Showtime Forever says oops L accidentally scroll down of the live. Showtime Forever says now L back. Pelitis Anagamurtic Toke says wow. Thank you Spy I guess for the follow. Pelitis Anagamurtic Toke says amazing, surprised face. Thank you Pelitis Anagamurtic Toke for the follow. Thank you G for the share. Jake Doe Stuff says do they have weapons? Thank you G for the share. Thank you G for the share. Thank you G for the share. Sunny Guy 122 says never skips leg day I see. Thank you GHHNNGH0 for the share. John Fitzgerald Kennedy says OUU she. Cookie says hot zam. Showtime Forever says never skip leg day. Jake Doe Stuff says at Cookie Mojito mentioned. Jake Doe Stuff says this looks like it's gonna be a cool show or comic. Jake Doe Stuff says it TBH. Clarp says remove the hip DIPs and it's fine. Showtime Forever says the best comic of the year. Hello 67HVJBVHKN says I scrolled back so fast. Jake Doe Stuff says do we have to become a member to see it? Says at Clarps no. Plus it's natural. Pelitis Anagamurtic Toke says I have a question, you are making a new drawing or just doing a better version of your old drawings? Trevin says wow. Jake Doe Stuff says dang those muscles. Pelidus Anagamurtic Toke says, oh, that's amazing, you drawing look good.
Get the!
Showtime Forever says I just realized why most people have like a thick parts is because those are just muscles inside. Thank you Zanks for the follow. Apologetic T says you're reminding me I gotta draw so many characters for my next book idea. Showtime Forever says but that how muscles work for our body. Two Quack for a Flack says fastest scroll back oh my days. Says workout carry. Says carry. Apologetic T says cold shoulder is lit. Pelidus Anagamurtic Toke says yeah, you are a really good artist. Apologetic T says your way of drawing mechs is so good. Cecily says those mech drawings are both very good. Jake Doe Stuff says it looks like it's from Transformers. Showtime Forever says they have like a Evangelion mix Pacific Rim mechs design. Thank you Mineral Prime 2003 for the follow. Pelidus Anagamurtic Toke says how you make lines so smooth. Apologetic T says I need to make cool stuff like this. Sunny Guy 122 says what is the new mech's name? Cecily says Rust. That's so cool. Apologetic T says shush, yours is cooler. Sunny Guy 122 says I don't care if I'm glazing, this is genuinely the coolest thing I've seen in a long while. Thank you, probably irritated for the follow. Sunny Guy 122 says do you have any characters named Sarah yet? Says no boring names guys PLSS. Apologetic T says what is your life schedule like now, so I can visit more often. Says Gray you need creative names. Jake Doe Stuff says honestly people who are hating are just jealous of you and think you're weird. YMEM283 says draw the 3 face. K says this is so tough. Pelatus Anagamurtic Toke says how you do your create your sketches for your drawings? I want to know. V. YMEM283 says no wait you have to read my comment to understand. YMEM283 says draw the 3. T1RED says oh you she. Cecily says Hilka, Myrtle, Electra, Marin, Percy, Saxony. YMEM283 says as a side thing. Jake Doe Stuff says at MM283 bro. K says how do you do the anatomy? Showtime Forever says what about Madison for this character name? Says Saxony or Electra Grey Def. Cecily says Zoe is a 10/10. Showtime Forever says I think Madison is a good name. Pelatus Anagamurtic Toke says yet, K have a very good question, how you make the anatomy? Says Saxony or Electra Grey Def. Thank you Nebula Series Explorers for the follow. YMEM283 says draw the silly face as a side thing like on the white background 3 this face look at the comment. SCP-049 Doodles says can you draw a night girl? Says Saxony or Electra Grey Def. Apologetic T says she's pretty. Cecily says AHN is cool. YMEM283 says you make comics? SCP-049 Doodles says, can you show us the night girl? Says name Carrie Saxony. K says you're so creative. Showtime forever says machine gun. YMEM283 says, can you gimme a advice? I never drew comics before and I really want to. Thank you SCP-049 Doodles for the follow. Cecily says, wow, that is a really nice drawing of Starlet. Jax says, fastest swipe up I've ever done. Pelletus Anagamurtic Toke says, is really difficult to create a own comic? Like, now you have one, right? YMEM283 says, you sunt get to talk, do you? Pelletus Anagamurtic Toke says, is difficult to make the story? Cecily says, me too. I like that knight, I like his simple face. SCP-049 Doodles says, inspired by 40K? K says, what theme is your comic? Says, this bot doesn't like me. YMEM283 says, before you draw, do you have to write things down to know what to draw? Sunny Guy 122 says, that's what it reminded me of, Doom. Says the speaker. YMEM283 says, IGTGCYA. K says, do you watch anime? SCP-049 Doodles says, too bad I can only draw horror, I've tried to draw like this but I have a hard time. I.M.M. says, new character or a new look. Thank you at D3 number for the share. Showtime forever says, it kinda sad when it reversed. Pelletus Anagamurtic Toke says, how you make the anatomy of your characters, you use the real human anatomy? Oh, you have special one. 7,000 likes. Outstanding. Sunny Guy 122 says, did we find a name for her yet? Showtime forever says, who this character? Pelletus Anagamurtic Toke says, cool. K says, I want to learn how to draw male character but I can only draw females. I.M.N. says, just call her Mrs. Sexy Pants. Showtime forever says, I got some cool names, I'll need some references from a movie. Says Cecily came up with the name Saxony, I like it. Cecily says, thank you for the support. Cecily says not for her too. Showtime Forever says hold up, L got some good names, IMA get a reference. I.M.N.Azan says no other artists. Pelitis Anagamurtiktok says well, now I have a question, how you make the female chest GG? Says yes Gray, you always pick boring names, it literally irks me so bad. Sunny Guy 122 says I'm a big artist, just nervous for posting my art. Cecily says anyone who disagrees with me gets blocked right at. I.M.N.Azan says give me ownership. Cecily says LMFAO. Says Lmu. SCP-049 Doodles says I can think of a name for her if you tell me what her abilities are. Says it was a joke Gray. K says at Pelitis Anagamurtiktok just draw 2 round circles. Cecily says I'm sorry, I was just kidding. Apologetic T says faces are pretty hard, but I love drawing them. I.M.N.Azan says at Kano that is a terrible tip. Says LMAO. Cecily says LOL. Showtime Forever says hold up, L got to do something, I'll be back. Sunny Guy 122 says we need to throw in names. Says Saxony. Cecily says I got a bajillion name ideas. Apologetic T says rain maybe. I.M.N.Azan says cheese puff. Says Saxony. Sunny Guy 122 says Sade. Says Saxony. Apologetic T says you got this, I believe in you. Sunny Guy 122 says Sade. I.M.N.Azan says Powerpuff. Pelitis Anagamurtiktok says what app or program you use to draw. Cecily says Electra, Saskia. I.M.N.Azan says Shakira. Says OMMG. Pelitis Anagamurtiktok says really? You are able to draw in Photoshop? Sunny Guy 122 says LOL Sade is a real name, that's my cousin's name. Cecily says Mayalen. Kay says Opal Clarity Raven. I.M.N.Azan says Elni. Says boring names. SCP-049 Doodles says okay I got one, Farida, based on ferrum which means blade in Latin. Cecily says wait isn't that the name of your character with the mask? Cecily says at. Wow. Showtime Forever says back. Sunny Guy 122 says Raven is cool, what you mean? Cecily says isn't there a Len already? SCP-049 Doodles says the name was Farida but it's based on ferrum meaning blade in Latin. I.M.N.Azan says I got it. It should be shoes. Kay says what is her personality? Cecily says Perko. Sunny Guy 122 says is her name officially Raven? I.M.N.Azan says even mine? Sunny Guy 122 says sorry not cheese puff or power puff or shoes. Colonimos Forestier Rose says how about Evelyn? I.M.N.Azan says Shaq. Kay says Esmeralda. SCP-049 Doodles says steel toe leather boots. Sunny Guy 122 says Eloan. Colonimos Forestier Rose says Eva is good. Cecily says Saxony Raven is fi. Kay says Robin. Says I hate THI SpeechBot. Sunny Guy 122 says Taylor. Says OMG. Says I've been saying the past same for 30 minutes no I hate it. I.M.N.Azan says Evangelion, 3.0 plus 1.0 thrice upon a time, would be a great name. Ishi says Gunnar She. Sunny Guy 122 says Mackenzie. Cecily says you're blocked. Says what? Says they're muted but you want to read my comment. Says the voice isn't the problem, it won't read the stuff I'm saying. Cecily says at. Too many characters in your name, I think it can't say it, sad face. SCP-049 Doodles says what's her hair color? Says it's not my name. Says it says everything else. Says C. K says what color palette for her do you have in mind? Says I don't care if it's not saying my name, it's not saying what I'm sending. Showtime Forever says nice art. Cecily says at. It is now. Says yeah I know, but some stuff it won't. K says you should give her black hair with dark blue highlights. SCP-049 Doodles says when is she set in, present, past, or future? Says make her masculine please, CEs is what I've been asking. I.M.N. says at. Just a bunch of complaining. SCP-049 Doodles says when is she set in, present, past, or future? Showtime Forever says alright, I'll gonna go do something else for now, have a great night. Sunny Guy 122 says dark clothes and some red, maybe some purple. Prolimugen says hi lol. Cecily says at Showtime Forever bye. Says at I.M.N. as in clearly I don't mind, I'm saying that the bot doesn't work sometimes. ECS says oh you she. Prolimugen says nat, Samurai Champloo. K says some black hair and some dark blue or red highlights. Cecily says what happened? Cecily says what sorry. Happened? Cecily says sorry. I.m.and says whom. I.m.and says whom. I.m.and says repeating. I.m.and says repeating. Cecily says yeah, it was very busy and kind of fun. Cecily says yeah, it was very busy and kind of fun. Cecily says sorry. I.m.and says whom. I.m.and says repeating. Cecily says yeah, it was very busy and kind of fun. Says hey. $400 likes. Epic. Says what's your YouTube? I.m.and says YouTube can go on as long as the poster wants. Thank you TUR for the follow. Thank you Ichimurki for the follow. Says I don't use it often. Paul Steph 34 says yo that looks fkin amazing. Thank you Paul Steph 34 for the follow. Says what I meant by masculine was lay curves. I.M.and says I think someone is trying to chat with you on YouTube. Says in more of a boyish body with despite less muscle. Sunny Guy 122 says you're back, what happened? I.M.and says you might need to open the chat with another ACC or open another tab. Sunny Guy 122 says before the live went dead, I was about to ask you if you had any tips or advice on making meshs. Cecily says I have no idea how YouTube Live works. I.M.and says live chat. I.M.and says yet. Colin Imos Forestier Rose says any lore for this character? Lil Sting Kai says is it upside down? Sunny Guy 122 says I remember earlier you were talking about having some horror characters or stuff like that. Colin Imos Forestier Rose says huzzah. Thank you Errol for the follow. Thank you Lirtha Lesbian for the follow. Thank you Slopida for the follow. Lirtha Lesbian says why she kind of hot. Thank you Mark for the follow. Lirtha Lesbian says okay well not kind of she is. Famlet work function says so you can draw. Slopida says is mine better? Sunny Guy 122 says only kinda, that's disrespectful lol. Lirtha Lesbian says my fault. I.M.N. says can I use your character to make some money? Lirtha Lesbian says god damn. Cecily says zo my goat. Lirtha Lesbian says hot as shit. Sunny Guy 122 says that is the goal. Thank you LUCAS205413 for the follow. I.M.N. says I can make some crazy eyes. Cecily says she looks nice and casual and relaxed like BRB. DRC0 Konat says nice drawing. Antiki says yeah drawing or something. Cecily says oh yeah, that is a good idea. DRC0 Konat says make me canon. I.M.N.Azan says how will she hold the handle? DRC0 Konat says I got good backstory. DRC0 Konat says I am a pirate orphan. Thank you the Emperor for the follow. Samamiarial says hands are pretty easy for me to draw IG. Cecily says the sword may need to be shrunk a little bit, lol. I.M.N.Azan says well the sword looks like it's blocked by some things. Sunny Guy 122 says that other character with the blade for a hand kinda reminded me of Syrinx from Blue Beetle. Sunny Guy 122 says Guy. I.M.N.Azan says it looks flipped a bit. Sunny Guy 122 says yeah he's really cool. Doom scrolling demigod says peak. Sunny Guy 122 says thanks for showing him lol. Drive Diet Pepsi says walked in on fucking gold. Sunny Guy 122 says whoa that's sick. Thank you Wild Tomato 23 for the follow. Wild Tomato 23 says I'm on cooldown. Fglix428117E750 says I love this art style. Samamiarial says I'm also Sam. Thank you Fglix428117E750 for the follow. Says I'm back. Sunny Guy 122 says I absolutely love stories with lots of characters. Thank you Makua for the share. Cecily says yes she looks really good. Says stay I longer. Sunny Guy 122 says will you be live tomorrow? SCP-049 Doodles says I'm back. I.M.N.Azan says well it doesn't need to fit perfectly. Sunny Guy 122 says I will definitely try to come back. Says aren't you live mostly every day besides weekends? Thank you Prototype for the follow. BJ says oh you she. Says I volunteer. Blue_soldier from F2 says sweet mother of pearl. Says WHYYYYYYY. Sunny Guy 122 says anything is possible. Says Cecily. The crazy captain says how do you use the line of action? Says right anything is possible. Cecily says I would be a great moderator. Says Cecily. Cecily says lol. Says but Cecily is funny. Cecily says ahush ha 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 ha. Thank you Lexiphilus for the follow. U.11111x says you make rule 34? Sunny Guy 122 says do you wear glasses? I.M.N.Azan says Keith put your glasses on. Says at Ionian Badger and he poses up like a Facebook mom with them too. Says blocking certain word. T4 Ngirov says goodness gracious. Says I have to do it every time I think. Thank you X10or for the follow. Cecily says 10/10 so far. Says no. Cecily says Saxony was my number one idea. Says not at all. Sunny Guy 122 says we need to pick a name by the end of the live. Cecily says I think one name is sufficient. Says wait. Says guys wait. Says we can pull it. Says what are the options? Sunny Guy 122 says good idea. Thank you Sanyan Zompung for the follow. Cecily says don't you already have a Robin? Sunny Guy 122 says loyal fan. Paul Steph 34 says one question, is this for a future work of yours or something similar? Bryson says OUU she. Says Raven Saxony and Gravoth says Ferrum. Gravoth says Eva. Gravoth says Robin. Paul Steph 34 says holy damn that looks badass. Sunny Guy 122 says tell us the cool idea. Real says Eva like Evangelion in how they pilot mechs. Thank you __ for the share. I.M.N.Azan says chicken. Flaxen _5 says can I show you one of my drawing and you can rate it? Says click up in the corner for the poll. Thank you Fang Noob for the follow. Says left corner. Cecily says I don't see it either. Says it looks like a clipboard. Sunny Guy 122 says top left corner. Paul Steph 34 says Ferrum sounds cool but Saxony sounds even cooler. Sunny Guy 122 says I see it. Says Saxony's winning. Cecily says it must look different on the computer, I don't see it on my computer. LUIS55TONY says OUU Shii. Sunny Guy 122 says let's go Saxony's winning. Says Saxony won. I.M.N.Azan says bro who are complaining in your YouTube live. Thank you CT5555 for the follow. I.M.N.Azan says or arguing. CT5555 says hi. Cecily says Saxony supremacy. I.M.N.Azan says animal documentary type music. I.M.N.Azan says Yowie Zawi. Sunny Guy 122 says wow even the creatures are baddas. Cecily says oh yeah, she is cool. Says I remember when you were making them. I.M.N.Azan says since it has so much holes, where else are they located? Thank you Skeleton 586 for the follow. Cecily says LOL good one. Says we should start making polls for names. Sunny Guy 122 says I just realized you are left-handed. I.M.N.Azan says you dare mute me. Says he is right-handed. Sunny Guy 122 says oh. Says at I.M.N.Azan I would do it again. I.M.N.Azan says at. And for what reason? Lirab says hello. Cecily says SUS questions are not allowed. says at I.M. and as in multiple inappropriate comments. I.M. and as in says they are not inappropriate. Cecily says PS, Pity Sorrows is a cool name. I.M. and as in says well the mod doesn't seem to know what are appropriate. Thank you CCCCTNH for the follow. Says at I.M. and as in I fear they were and usually I let some inappropriate comments slide. Cecily says the characters will be feetless like Cold Shoulder. I.M. and as in says at. The character has holes. Are you indicating that it wouldn't have spots? Thank you HybroPie for the share. Thank you HybroPie for the share. I.M. and as in says I will drop the mic on you. Cecily says oh. Says at I.M. and as in he had stop. Why are you still talking? There's no point in arguing. Thank you Choso for the follow. I.M. and as in says at. There was also no point in muting me. Fern says who is the character? Ricardo says Giudeum. Sunny Guy 122 says Pity Sorrows kinda reminds me of Man Spider. Sunny Guy 122 says yes I have, also could all those spots be its eyes possibly? Sunny Guy 122 says that's pretty cool. Cecily says how long are you gonna be live today? Choso says are we seriously muting for absolute no reason? Jay says oh you she. Says at Choso first of all no there was a reason. Vlad says oh you she I. Sunny Guy 122 says I was about to say that, Baddies got affected by the disease but left some of themselves behind lol. Says at Choso spamming inappropriate comments. I.m.and.azan says at. He was putting an emoji. Cecily says how long are you gonna be live today? If I may ask. I.m.and.azan says can we revoke this power for a second? Says at I.m.and.azan which was inappropriate for the art. Says at I.m.and.azan I really don't see why you're trying to argue with me. I.m.and.azan says at. Can we not express our feelings to the art? Jones says laugh laugh. Sunny Guy 122 says multiple times you asked to drop it. Thank you El Manos for the follow. Sunny Guy 122 says even I was getting irritated lol. Cecily says going to eat a bagel, I'll be back if you're still live soonish. Sunny Guy 122 says anyways, Have you made any character with weapon that come out their shoulders like missiles? Sunny Guy 122 says I think missile launchers would be very cool. Cut off isti hand make he hand clap says oh you she. James says that is not REZE. Sunny Guy 122 says will there be like a king or queen of the pity sorrows, like a leader? Sunny Guy 122 says damn, you can make baddies and daddies. Sunny Guy 122 says I really like his eyes and his hair. Isaac 909 says smash. Keat Boy says ZAMN. Sunny Guy 122 says alright, good night man, this was really cool. Says bye.